So everyone,
So
if you
everyone,
and you can
if
do
you
this while being in video chat, because I'm sure sometimes some people are new to Discord. So just to clarify, we can click over from Masterclass Audio into Masterclass Submissions, and in the Masterclass Submissions tab, you'll see the recording and the score links for the pieces that are going to be played tonight. We're going to go in the order of the pieces that you see on the list. And for Ian's two submissions, the scores are actually in the YouTube videos with the music, so that'll be helpful. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to Daniel Francis' recording of the Spheling Chromatic Fantasy on the harpsichord. If you want to follow along in the score, you can do that. Make sure to mute yourself so we don't hear any background noise or any interruptions in the middle of the performance, quote unquote, that he'll be giving us. And then after the performance is over, we'll come back here. Those of us that have our videos on now will turn back on our videos. I will send out a message in Masterclass text asking, which is the page or the tab above Masterclass submissions. I'll make sure everyone's ready to go and that everyone's finished the piece, and once everyone has finished listening to that one piece, we will reconvene. Um, I'll discuss what I need to discuss with Daniel about it, and then I'll open up the floor to um, comments from everybody, and then we'll just move along from there. So, having said that, let's mute ourselves and go listen to Daniel's recording. done. Okay, cool. Okay, well, if 9 people just click that check mark that fast, then we're good. So, thank you, Josh, for that. So, Daniel, there was some really cool stuff in that piece. I love that piece, especially coming from Spelink. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of Spelink's works, but that one in particular is really one that I like. Just because Spelink was kind of the, as Dr. Dodds would put it at School of the Arts, he's the rock star of that era. He was the cool guy with the hippie hair doing the concerts that and the women loved him. He was a really he was a cool composer of that time. And if you think that's quite a ways before Bach even came along, and you're having this kind of chromaticism already, which is just really cool to think about. So I'm going to start with a question to Daniel, and that is, and this is a really important topic because we have so many pianists here. We have just pianists everywhere in here. We're plagued by them. I'm kidding. So, all these pianists in here, and this is a harpsichord. We're hearing this on the harpsichord, and it would be a disservice to everyone if we didn't cover this. So, what what is the essence of life in Baroque music, Daniel? What brings Baroque music to life? And you're muted, by the way.
Uh, I think the answer you're expecting is
I'm
something
not
like
looking
a
for what I'm
situation.
expecting. I want to know what you think about it. I don't care what I expect.
We always talk about articulation in early music and the importance of that.
Well, articulation is certainly a thing that we can do, but it goes much farther beyond that. Like, there wouldn't be any articulations if we didn't do gestures, for example. And there wouldn't be any gestures if we didn't have the Baroque art of rhetoric, for example. So it goes, it's step by step by step by step. It's an understanding that a culture that plays into the rhetoric of that culture, which plays into the gestures of that culture, which plays into the articulation of the piece, which then plays into how we shape phrases. It's a multi-level system here that we have to guide ourselves through, which is not even covered on piano. I mean, I don't know because it's not a thing that's really applicable to piano because pianists, some parts of it are, but pianists don't have the tools available to them that you have at a harpsichord or an organ. And at the same time, harpsichordists don't have the tools that are available to them at the piano, which is why it's so important for pianists to play Baroque instruments and pre-Baroque instruments. And that's why it's so important for harpsichordists and organists to play piano. I don't think keyboardists should be just related to piano. I don't think a pianist should just be stuck on the piano. I don't think an organist should just be stuck on the organ. I think a keyboardist should be a keyboardist. I think that you should be proficient in harpsichord, that you should be proficient in organ, and that you should be proficient in piano because when you're when you're truly a keyboardist in that definition of the sense, that gives you a much more personal and in-depth understanding of all the music that you're playing, and you can carry things from one instrument to the other. Now, in terms of this chromatic fantasy which you played by Svalink, what would be your number one criticism of it as a performer?
I never get convinced of the beginning part. Like
What do you mean by
to
that?
build an environment, it has
Let
to
me look
be
at the
a
score.
fantasy. What?
Uh, oh, nothing, nothing. I'm pulling back up the score to look at it as you're talking. Go ahead.
I have to do the beginning part, start with one voice, then the other one, make like the counterpoint that looks like a fugue, but it's a fantasy. So it must be kind of free. It must be expressive because of the chromatism and actually a whole environment in a few seconds. Like the beginning is the part I recorded most times. I
Hmm.
recorded over and over again because I wasn't satisfied with the result. And then the ending was like, okay, just play fast notes and more automatic kind of.
And so If you had to put that into a concise criticism, what would that be?
Like I think I
Because
could have
your entire
played
idea there
more
is
freely. I could have
mm,
be more expressive during the piece. Also, I have to make like a kind of a story and change the character during the piece because it's like 8 minutes and kind of boring to think the same concept in the whole thing.
mm. So you're absolutely right, and you hit the criticism. You hit the nail on the head, and that is that it you had a and you hinted at this you hinted at this a lot of times, and it sounded like it was trying to break free at some points, but it sounded like either I can't pinpoint it because I'm not you. This is a question for you. It sounded like you were too nervous or too worried about notes or too concerned about the technical aspects of this, especially playing on the harpsichord which you played on, that that inhibited the ability of the piece to have the character that it so desperately needs. And it needs that longevity of the phrase. It needs the gesture. It needs the shaping of that that phrase, which includes the gestures and articulations of it. But the articulations and gestures just they aren't there to serve the fault that many teachers how do I say this? The fault that many teachers encounter when they try to talk about you must do music this way and you must do it this way. You must do Baroque articulations this way in music, and every teacher has their own version of saying that, but they never tell you why. And that is that these articulations that I'm about to suggest to you, and they're merely a suggestion, are tools that in which I believe can help shape the fantasy of this piece, because this piece needs to have a wild side. It needs to have that fantastical side. It needs to be more rambunctious. It needs to have um, a crazier personality to it, because this piece that was you did a lot of things great in there, but overall it was too tame for a rock star. That was it was too it was too scared. It was too compressed is a really good word for it. And so I'll get to good practice habits in this piece in a minute. But just talking about the opening, because that's a really good place to start. And I'm looking at the score right now. I'm clicking back and forth between the video and the score. You had this chromatic line that descends down, and you're talking about how how to make it not boring, how to make it like a fantasy, how to make the first two voices the invention, quote unquote, part of this piece until the third voice comes in, and what would be the pedal on the organ, but in this case in your left hand. And I'll tell you that it takes more of a musician to play the first two lines well than it does the whole rest of the piece. Because if you can make the first two lines sound good, which is the most bare minimum of music possible to write, essentially. I mean, essentially, you're looking at a hyped up Renaissance Palestrina counterpoint here. I mean, it's just you're looking at parallel sixths, parallel thirds, voice leading. He goes up a different direction. He hops down a different direction, but he counters that by a second. You're looking at textbook voice leading here. So this is the bare minimum of what really great music can be. But the thing is, and the key thing about that is that this is still great music. And people oftentimes get the most advanced musicians will look at this and say it's boring, it's lifeless, it has nothing to it. But that's not the case, because it's a misunderstood art. First of all, it's quite frankly a lost art. And like I said, it takes more of a musician to play this than it does the entire rest of the piece. Because if you can make these first two lines sound good, um, that shows not only a competent skill of the style, but it shows the inner ability which you have. And I think you have that, but I'm not sure you have the tools or you actually know how to bring that about. Um, and the biggest thing in Baroque music that I can say that for you that you should do is timing, because the timing of things is what makes things exciting. Stretching a little bit, pulling a little bit. Um, and I always relate this timing to the natural laws of physics. It's like a ball going up and down a hill. If you have a ball sitting on top of the hill, it's not going to go down the hill like someone kicked it. If it just starts rolling down the hill, it's not going to go off the side of the hill and start flying into outer space. A ball is going to slowly roll down a hill. It's going to go down the hill. It's going to speed up, and as it goes to the bottom of the hill and starts going back up, it's going to have this beautiful natural curve to it. And that natural curve, thinking about natural laws of physics and how that plays a role in musical phrasing, is of the absolute most importance in Baroque music and how to shape it. And that's how people like, Andras Schiff and other great Baroque performers get this very, very transcendent, ethereal, maybe almost even sometimes childlike innocence in their music, because they're not doing anything to it necessarily. They're letting physics play the music for them, which is actually a really interesting thing to think about. And a lot of times you'll see that ends up bringing music to life, because physics, first and foremost, is not only the foundation of music, but it's the foundation of life. It's how we live. And so I think, the foundation of where music comes from deserves a little bit more attention in music because that's often quite neglected. So, in terms of technicalities, let's look at the first line of the score. So you have this descending chromatic line, which is answered at the fifth in the right hand, and then you have this ascending, um, really just a scalar quarter note line. Um, and the way you played it, it was. I heard exactly what you were saying. It was more of a bum 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 beam bum 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 bum. It was very straight. Um, all the notes were the same, and because all the notes were the same, it didn't really have a direction to it. And so, even with that first line, with the first chromatic going from the D to the A, the left hand alone, um, you can very easily shape that like a ball rolling down a hill. You can have this bum, and I'm going to speed it up for the sake of time, but it could be bum, bum, be dum, bum, and then be dum, pum, 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 pa da 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 dee, dum, pum. And having this idea of a pickup note, beam, pom, because intervals are where, so the core, looking at this Baroque structure that I talked about, looking at the core examination of it, the very foundational principle of that, the very, very bottom of the hierarchy is articulation. And articulation finds itself in Baroque music within the intervallic, you know, degree of the notes. So you wouldn't do as much articulation between, the A and B of the first part of the quarter note scale run. You wouldn't go B ha 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 ha. They're all, that whole run is all, seconds. They're major seconds, except for the B to C. They're seconds. But then you get this leap of a fourth, this bum bum, and if you play that leap of a fourth like you played the same interval of a second, then that is not making it special. It's not making it go anywhere. And that's the first leap of a fourth that you get and end the piece, because it's so important to have that direction, that you have the foundation of Baroque music starts at the intervals. And if you're not highlighting the intervals, then you can't move up that hierarchy. So you have this ba dum beat dum pom pom pim pom pom pim pa da 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 tom. And really, another key to this idea of Baroque music is that you have freedom, but this isn't a Buxtehude, Fantasia, and this isn't a Bach free work. This isn't, the beginning of the Prelude and Fugue in A minor. This isn't some great Fantasia and Fugue of Bach's. This is still a measured work. And so this raises the question, the idea of having this metric impulse within the larger scope of the work, but also at the same time, how do you have freedom within a metric impulse? And in this case, I really do think that in a general sense, and we can touch on specific areas in a minute, but in a general sense, the largest and most effective way to generate that freedom in such a work is by having, no, by showing a very, very important, a very, very specific, um, importance to the meter of the piece. And I'm saying meter signature over time signature because meter indicates the pulse, and the pulse indicates the weak and soft beats of measure. In this case, it will be 1 and 3, 1 being the strongest, 3 being the medium, 2 and 4 being the weak beats. And if you stretch 1 and 3, that allows you time to quickly almost diverse right through the other notes into the next phrase. Because, and I don't mean quickly in terms that you have to rush to them. It gives you the ability to be free with them, do what you want, because you've stretched the first beat. So now it's like, what's going to happen next? You know, it's not bum beam ba ba bum ba bum. You know, it's not because that's what happened, and that's not so interesting. You know, it doesn't. Not only is it not interesting, it's not the Baroque, and it loses the character of the piece really quickly. And this piece is deadly if you don't do that, because it ends up being more or less 8.5 minutes of the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. But what Svaling does so well in this piece compositionally, and what a lot of Baroque composers do, is that they invert the materials and stuff. So rather than, and they invert the materials, they do it a lot. Some composers do it in retrograde. They do all sorts of really compositionally brilliant things with these melodic ideas, these structural ideas, you know, the transitions between sections, and knowing how to bring these out is so important. So going back to that scale run, because this is the foundation of the whole piece, and so rather than going like a measure by measure thing in the whole piece, you know, that's not necessary, because the first measure, the first two systems of the piece, they cover the majority of the piece in terms of what you need to work on. So going back to that first left hand part where it's in quarter notes, beam bum bum be bum pom bum be dee dum bum dim pa da 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 tom bum be ba ba bum. Having that t da 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 t da 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 dum, and that C, the first note of that measure, where you have the 16th notes in the left hand, that t da 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 dum. It's it's elegant, it's playful, but you have that first C, and that one is elongated the most. The A on the third beat of that measure is not, it's just ever so slightly lessened. And by having the C shortened, I mean the C elongated, that lets you flow down to the A, and then putting people on the edge a little bit brings you down to the F. So it comes down to thinking about this smaller picture so that the higher picture is able to function. I mean, it's just like a structure of hierarchy. If the people at the top cannot function, if the minute details at the bottom are not being worked out, it's all about having a good order system. So the first thing I would tell you about this piece is go back and don't. My warning to you is don't overcomplicate it, don't overthink it, and don't over concern yourself with it, because that'll take you too far, and that'll make it sound just a different kind of robotic. But, and that's, you know, a lot of times students, a teacher will tell a student one thing, they'll take it and they'll overdo it the first week, and the next lesson comes to a teacher and plays it, and it's like, okay, you know, you understand the principle now, but you overdid it, so let's really back in. And, you know, that's, if that happens, fine. It's a musical process of learning, but I'm just telling you that try not to overcomplicate it if you can. But my primary advice to you is to develop that order structure within the music so that you can generate the freedom that it needs, because it's about keeping people on edge. Because it's like, how do you turn that one measure of 16th notes into anything interesting? Because if you look at that for what it is, it's really not interesting. It's not brilliant compositional writing. So you think, well, what makes it brilliant? And that is the suspense, that is the character, that is the fantastic freedom of the Baroque that you add to it. So my general consensus for the piece is that that's exactly what you need to do: is pay attention to the intervals, pay attention to how they affect the articulation, pay attention to how the articulation affects the gestures, and then pay attention to how the gestures affect the larger rhetoric of the piece, what you're trying to say in the piece, what you're trying to convince somebody of, what you're trying to deliver, whether it's like whatever that be. How does that structure play into this being a master work of the Baroque? Because it really is of the early Baroque. Um, and um, that also, I just want to touch on the free sections with a lot of 16th notes. This occurs starting on page 8 of the score. If you guys are looking on the IMSLP score, you have all these running 16th notes, and without me trying to viciously murder any reputation I have left already by singing those fast 16th notes, because I just won't even attempt that. Um, remember the same principle that I just mentioned, that it's the idea of elongation, suspense, and drawing people through the entirety of the piece. And it's really hard to take a large scale work like this with such a large scale concept and condense that into a masterclass somewhere other people have to understand it, you have to understand it, and have to convey the point across, you know, so that you can perform it the next time. But especially in you said that when you get to the really fast notes, particularly the triplets at the end, I believe they were, and the 30-second notes, like you see in the third system of page 8, those tend to be just rushed through. Like they tend to be more just like turn on the automatic switch and just like, you know, just get through them really quick as you can so that you don't mess up. But those are the most exciting parts of the piece. And so when you have these moments, remember what I just said about the beginning of the piece and apply that to these notes and allow yourself time to breathe, allow the piece time to breathe, allow the notes time to breathe because the notes are there. The notes are there, and on a harpsichord it's very easy to play the notes because the action is so light. So you can take your time, you can elongate this and this, you and remember to improvise as you go along because the key component to this Baroque music, and especially these these long passages of the sixteenths over these quarter notes. It's very simple compositional writing, especially contrapuntal writing. And on top of that, this was probably something that Sweelinck improvised. And I'm not sure if he did write this down first or improvise this first. Regardless of whether or not he did that, he improvised things like this all the time for whether it was church service or for his friends or for himself when he was practicing composition, you know, whatever it was. Remember that this first and foremost is an improvisation. And if it doesn't have that improvisatory aspect, that excitement, that not knowing what's next through the principles I just talked about, that it's not going to be able, you're not going to be able to carry an audience or yourself for that matter, like you said, through the piece. So um, make sure these long sections of 16th notes, they have freedom, they have a metric stability, but they have this large, not quite greater than life, but greater than what you were doing earlier sense about them. And my last thing is the triplets, well, really the sextuplets, on the next to last page of the piece. The same thing for those. Those your tempo when you hit those things, it was like, oh, panic mode, tempo time. For some reason, I do it myself. When panic mode comes on, we just make it harder for ourselves and get way faster. I don't know why that's the way we are. Humans are. I don't understand humans, but it's what happens. So instead of hitting the panic mode button there and accelerating the tempo to 90 beats faster per minute than you were going, um, first of all, try to actually keep it, you know, relatively the same tempo. And on top of that, don't forget the principles that I just discussed because I don't want to have to repeat myself because it's essentially the same fundamental set of rules and principles and ideas and the set of improvisation um, thoughts and ideas that you really have to consider in a piece like this. Um, and my very, very last thing is that I'm really surprised you didn't do this, but on the harpsichord, it would have been very stylistic for the very last system, the very last measure actually. Dee da 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 dee da 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 da. You know, the harpsichord is it would have been much appropriate and pretty much needed in the style of this piece to have that trill with the running arpeggios up and down the keyboard. And then you could have resolved it, you know, a 6/4, a 6/5 suspension, a 4/3 suspension. You could have done all these different suspensions, a 9/8, whatever you wanted to do in the last chord of that piece, and just to really bring out that long dissonance, that built up tension that you've had for the whole rest of the piece with this great pedal point that you've had. So those are my comments to you, and I'm now opening up the floor to Josh, and he can open the floor up to people for discussion after that. Oh, actually, before Josh, do you have any questions, Daniel, or does that make sense? You're muted. Oh no, you're not. You're not.
There's one thing about the first phrase. What I was thinking before is that like
The
goes
first.
like dun, 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 da, 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 da. Da, 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 pum, pum, dum, pum, dum, 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 da, 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 or when it says dee, da, 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 dee, da, dee, da, da, those parts, like when you say like that, I could stop there before hitting like dee, 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 all the.
Yeah. Mm,
I think that's just like the coda from the phrase.
sure.
I was
Absolutely.
trying not to make music though.
Mhm.
Purpose.
Well, I mean, another option you could do, like you said, is if it's appropriately done, of course, and it doesn't throw off the big, larger pulse of the piece. I think a trill, an effective trill, or maybe not calling it a trill, maybe a decoration is a better word for it. Of that first set of 16th notes could be effective. Beam, pom, dum, yada, da, 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 just da, 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 da. You could definitely put an effective trill in there. But you have to be careful that it doesn't, one, you don't draw too much attention to it, so you don't want to go overboard. But at the same time, you don't want it to throw off the larger phrase, gesture, pulse, et cetera, of the piece. You want the piece to have a uniformity to it and a draw from first note to last note. Um, but absolutely, you could throw in ornaments in a lot of places. That's one actually another thing I should have commented on is that the freedom to throw in ornaments. You could have done a lot with ornaments in this piece. And I would encourage you to go back and even if you end up overdoing it the first time, who cares? Experiment. Throw in ornaments here and there. Improvise. Just improvise as you go. Don't do the same thing twice. And if you like it, maybe keep it. But yeah, yeah, you can do a lot with this. All right, Josh, and then you can open up.
Okay, so I have never actually played this piece. I've listened to it a few times over the years, but the first thing that struck me is that when you're looking at pieces called fantasies from throughout the Baroque era, they of course refer to several different things, and this looks a lot more like fantasies from Italy at the time than fantasies from North Germany several years later. So this looks a lot more like the fantasies of Frescobaldi or Zipoli than it does the fantasies of Buxtehude, at least in terms of metric structure and that sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind. That can serve as sort of a justification for keeping some sort of metric structure, despite the fact that it's labeled as a fantasy. That aside, I don't have that much to add on top of what Matt said because essentially what he said is pretty solid. Just I would say, yeah, if anything, I would just give another example, and that's that throughout the piece, scattered through bits of it, there's this sort of idea where it's an eighth note leading into two 16th notes. So and it repeats itself. So dum ba da dum da da dum, that sort of idea. And I think places like that are a fantastic place to play with timing. So because instead of just going, dun da da dun da da dun da da dun da, that's no interesting. But if you hold the first note just a little bit, stretch it just a little bit, dun da da dun da da dun da da, let it fall down. It's like something falling down a set of stairs. It makes it so much more interesting. But that all just falls under the same umbrella of a little bit more freedom within the beat, and just sort of that improvisatory expression that the piece really wants. The quick scales up and down, which are written as 30-second notes for the most part through the score, it's fairly standard practice to keep those even more free than the 16th notes. So just do whatever you feel like doing as you decide to do it when you play those, and don't worry too much, as long as the overall metric structure stays intact. But and then also one other thing that could help, it might be helpful to keep in the back of your mind as you do that, is in any chromatic pieces like this, and another example would be the from one of the Frescobaldi organ masses. There's a chromatic. He labels it as a toccata, but the structure and theme is almost exactly the same as this. And when I play through that, I think very carefully about where the dissonances and releases are, because putting a little bit of extra weight and stretching the dissonances a little bit farther, and then lightening up on the kind of on the resolutions can be very effective, and that's definitely something to keep in mind as you're playing that. That's about all I have to say.
Great, thank you, Josh. Assuming Ian has something to say like normal, I'm opening the floor up to comments now, so anyone can just jump in whenever they want. Feel free to just jump in, and it's a free reign now. And then once everyone's done, we'll move on. But yeah, go ahead. Free open floor.
Well, if I can just make 2 questions slash comments. The first one is coming back to what Matt started out with regarding playing keyboards, but that there are differences between a harpsichord versus a piano versus an organ, frankly, versus other keyboards like clavichords or whatnot. I was just thinking about if I was playing this on the organ, I would play this differently from the way I played on a harpsichord. And I think that you in your comments, Daniel, before the session, you referred to this, that that on the harpsichord there are rolls, there are things that are arpeggiating and things like that you would do on a harpsichord, and that you can do on a harpsichord, and they sound more convincing on a harpsichord that you simply wouldn't do an organ if you're playing this on the organ. And to the another point that Matt made, that I think you could actually take that further in terms of some of the things like ornamentation. I mean, ornamentation on a harpsichord, one of the purposes of ornamentation on a harpsichord is because the sound of the harpsichord fades so quickly. The ornamentation actually prolongs it, the sound. So even like the very first note announcing the theme of this fantasia, that if on an organ you don't need to ornament it at all, that first 2 lines. But I was almost thinking on the harpsichord there is a reason potentially to ornament, simply from the physics point of view, that it prolongs the note. If you've got nothing else playing and you've just got one note and it's a long note and it's fading, that ornamenting it actually prolongs the sound, which is part of the reason why on the harpsichord you do those kinds of things. So that was just one comment that I thought, if you thought it more, take it even further in terms of your harpsichord practice for this piece, as opposed to playing it on another instrument like the organ, where you don't need to, and it will work. So that was my first kind of question, comment, whether you want to think about that. The second thing was, I found it actually quite interesting that the edition that we're reading from is it's a French Romantic score for the organ and written like for the organ. And I my thought was that even though you obviously do not want to play like you're playing this on a cave call by Guimont, right? You don't want to play it like that, clearly. But nonetheless, there are ideas in the way that Guimont presented this that go to there are musical ideas about the structure and the contrast of the piece. Even if you don't want to play it like that, it is actually, I found it actually interesting to think about what Guimont was thinking about in terms of his structure. Whether you agree with them or not, they are musical ideas about the piece that just simply come out of that edition, which you can take back and think about, and whether what you do with them is another question. But it's a way about thinking about the piece that it's another dimension that kind of adds to the richness of the piece. That's why these pieces are masterpieces, because they can be reinterpreted in every age. But it's always useful to think about, I found it interesting that actually just reading the edition, to think about, oh, that's the way that he thought of it in his inner ear. Guimont, that is. Not necessarily Svelling. I mean, Svelling might have thought about it in a completely different way, but who knows? Anyway, that's it for me.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ian. Does anyone have any other comments to make about this? All right. Well, in that case, let's move on. So Some people joined last time, they weren't here. So just to clarify, I want to run through it one last time. For those of you who joined late, when you joined, we were listening to Daniel's performance, which is in the tab above Masterclass Audio. If you click on it, you'll see tonight's Masterclass program essentially listed. So Daniel's is done, and we're going to listen now to Will's performance of this etude. And so essentially what we'll do is we'll listen to the performance, we will mute ourselves, and then once we are done listening to it, Josh will just send out a thing in Masterclass text, and everyone can just check mark it when they're done. People who have their videos on now will just turn on our videos, and we'll reconvene and talking about it. So let's go listen to the second performance Will's recording tonight. Josh, has everyone watched the Lyapunov? I'm counting on you for this one. Let's see. Well, I'm now the 12th because I feel like clicking it, so because I enjoy clicking buttons. So, okay. Well, Lyapunov it is. So, first of all, congratulations on playing a ever so slightly challenging piece. Just ever so slightly above the Ravel Prelude in A minor, which, as you know. So it's just a bit over easy. Or yeah, it's hard. So this is a great piece, and a lot of things you did in here were really great. It's at first it's a daunting piece until you realize that there's actually quite a lot of really beautiful poetry in this piece. And one of the main things that I'm going to talk about is essentially I have two main points to talk about in this, and that is that how it is one, the separation of intensity, not intensity, that's a bad way to put it, the separation of the non-poetry versus the poetry. And another way that one could think about that in a sense is, when I'm envisioning like this battle for, and this is not necessarily related directly to the piece, but rather a helpful envisioning tool maybe, that you have this these two conflicting memories, and one is of this great battle, but the other one is the poetry, which is the reason for the battle. It's maybe here's the great battle, here's all the men dying, the blood, the severed body parts, but then here's the other separate memory of the princess and her running through these beautiful lush green fields and this almost Hollywood-like picture of just this total beauty that you have streaming through this, and then how that connects, how those two memories, quote unquote, connect to each other. Just really turning the memories into musical ideas, how those two musical ideas connect to each other, as well as how to make them flow efficiently from one to another, as well as maybe even more importantly, things to do within. And this is really going to the second point that I was going to cover in this, the major point, that is things to do in each section that make them stand out from the other one, that make them what they are, and that whether it be, tempo retention and all these different techniques for these climaxes and accents and, lots of really tone color and how and where and how to, like what color to get where and different ideas that we can do with that. But the first thing that struck me off this was I listened to this about 4 to 6 times because this is just a massive piece. And I listened to it a lot before the Masterclass. This is like my 7th time hearing it, roughly 6th or 7th. Because I had, the first listening of this was, it's a lot to take in on one listening, so I had to keep on doing it over and over and over the past 2 days. And I've gotten a really good feel for your performance of it and a good sense of the performance. And overall, it's more than commendable. And Josh can second this, that I don't hand out compliments ever. So it's more than commendable that you've learned this and played it at such a high level. And I know nobody here, including myself, gives a shite about any wrong notes that you played in this. No one could care less. That what we're here to talk about mainly and fundamentally is the musicality, and that's what I intend to talk about. The first thing that struck me was that there's 3 things on the first page that I think were left out more or less, and that sets you up for the whole piece. And the first is not to come at it hard, but the first was tempo, and that is that the tempo would like in the da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, that da-da-da-dum, bum, da-da-da-da-dum, the first 4 notes were actually much slower than the triplets following it, and not because it's a triplet followed by a dotted 8th note, but rather like the actual tempo of that set of notes was actually slower than the ones following it. And I'm clicking back and forth between the score and the video, but I'm looking at the first page of the score right now, and the accent, of course, in the F sharp being important. And it's ironic that this first page, the construction of this compositionally, actually resembles so much, even with the seconds followed by the thirds, followed by the seconds, followed by the thirds, resembles the Phalanx chromatic fantasy that we were just talking about. And so, but this is a whole different ballgame. This isn't the suspension and the gestures and articulation and carrying people to the end. This is a relentless Prokofiev-esque, I'm going to beat you on the hammer into submission until you like this piece, essentially more. And so this has this great drive to it. And the first thing that creates this drive is that suspense of the F sharp, but even more so, the absolute rigid tempo of this. I think that this has to have an absolutely rigid tempo. I mean, I can't emphasize the word rigid enough. I mean, just like you could like imagine if who was it that told me this? It was Frederick Blanc that told me this in reference to Napoleon, and it was actually quite funny. He said that if the French army cannot march to your beat, it's not a good enough beat. And so you have to imagine, the army. You have to imagine Napoleon essentially if you want to have that. You don't have to, but that the idea of having that rigid, relentless, and that's the key word I think in this piece is relentless beast of a beat. And just giving that from the first F sharp, the first note of that should be from then on out. That's the pulse. That's where we're going. The second thing was that looking at the dynamics, the mezzo forte was not so different from the fortissimo in the second system. It was more or less the same dynamic. And so that's another general comment that I'll touch on a lot, but I can pretty much sum up now, so I don't have to repeat myself over and over. And that is that a lot of the dynamics in this piece weren't actually observed. Like when you had mezzo forte, forte, fortissimo, and piano going from one system into another, it was more or less mezzo forte to forte and back to mezzo forte. Like and in a piece like this, it's the sharpness and the rigidness and the contrast of these things which brings out the excitement. Because in a piece like this, there isn't the elements of the Baroque that we have. We don't have these tools of freedom, so to say, where we can stretch all these wonderful, free improvisation-esque passages. This is through very thought-out composition. And so we're looking at composer's intent versus improvisational intent, which is a whole different ballgame. And so attention to the most minute of details is the most important in this piece. And really, that on top of this being an etude of technique, this piece, I think more than anything, is a tour de force of detail, because there's so much minuscule, minute detail that if you've been playing this piece for a year, you can still fly by it and miss. Because, I had to study the score relentlessly with this before I could even, talk about it. So I prepared a lot, looking at the score and getting familiar with this piece, because it's so much to it. And so the observation of the dynamics and how they go from one to the other is really crucial. And even on the house piano, there's still a lot more that one can do going from mezzo forte to fortissimo in that first system. Another thing, and my third thing that I want to talk about on the first page is the accents. All the accent markings on those notes were pretty much undistinguishable from the regular notes, which obviously wouldn't be the case, or shouldn't be the case, because he wrote in the accents there. And and interestingly enough, and I think I was watching you technically, the accents in the jumping chord, the bum 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 bum, the accents were actually being put on the F sharp octaves and in your left hand when you were jumping down to them. One was because instead of being already here and having your hand positioning here and you're comfortable more up here, you jumped, you had that momentum, and then you came down on it. And then not only did you come down on it, but you actually used your fingers to push off of it, almost like a spring. So you springed off of it, which is a conversation about the attack and the release of the note. How you play the note versus how you lift it up, and how that creates a certain sound. And the attacks and the releases created a very, very strong accent on the F sharps that you were going down to, which actually weren't the notes that were supposed to get the accent. So in a lot of places, it ended up feeling like the F sharps were actually the grounding of the beat rather than the off beats, the syncopation of the beat in a sense. And that F sharp is so important too, because it really is a type of syncopation, because you have the tied note, the da-da-dum-bum, ba-da-dum-bum, that F sharp above it. So it's really coming in on the offbeat of these triplets. And in order to establish that, the accents, again, it's about this rigorousness, this rigidness, this relentlessness of keeping every minute detail in just this formation. And the same thing going when it has a decrescendo going into the piano section. It was essentially mezzo forte. It really didn't change much from the section before, other than that there weren't the big leaps being done. It was essentially the same volume, more or less. And so this is, we have this big battle-esque, almost Romanesque, like this huge opening. But we have this, this is flurries. This is something in the wind. This is, imagine it whatever you like. This is things scurrying on the water. This is tension rising. And the thing about this piece is that the tension comes out of the soft sections. That, in a way, this entire piece, up until the very end of the piece, the entire piece prepares you compositionally, even from a compositional perspective for composers. It prepares you compositionally for the quiet sections. And in the quiet sections, it's almost Liszt-like technique of composition where he's giving you more tension than there is in the entire combination of all the loud sections of the piece in the pianissimo, in the piano sections, because it's this demonesque, this evil, this invasive almost, like a gnat or something in your ear buzzing. It's and if we don't have that quietness, we actually don't get the tension. And so when contrary to what like a lot of people actually think and what a lot of like young pianists do, is that having this be louder and not actually be a true piano takes away from not only the compositional brilliance, but the musical brilliance and the overall structure of the piece, and being able to go between those two memories, those two giant musical ideas between the poetry and the conflict. And so make sure that in these quiet sections that it's almost annoying, not annoying, but almost. It's this relentless. It's just buzzing, like this hissing, this building up. And then let me pull up this. Moving on from that. So specifically, a technical thing that I noticed is that when you would center yourself on the beat, and you didn't rush the whole time, don't get me wrong, you did not rush the whole time. There were plenty of sections where it was rock solid and it was great, it was exciting. And those sections were great until you got to the chords and alternatum, the alternating chords. So I can give an example. I guess going back to the first page, I can give an example. The end of the second system on the first page, da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, those da-da-da-dum, the running octaves with sometimes the fifth in the middle. Those will become a completely different tempo than the triplets before them. I'm not sure what the personal reasoning for that was, whether it was a technical thing, whether it was maybe you thought the chords were sounding slower as like because the hammer was something with the hammer. I don't know. Maybe it was an action thing on the piano. I'm not sure. But whenever, and this was a consistent thing, whenever you had the octave chords in the piece, every single time you had them sped up.
Yeah, I think it was just a like psychological mistake because the hands are playing the notes kind of twice as slow as you think the run should be. So
yeah, and I get that 100%. And so really, well, I'll talk about the practice methods in a minute for this, but essentially it comes down to refining it within a probably 2 or 3 practice methods that come to mind. And then the next thing was page 97. So I'm looking at the score, and it's page 97 on the score that he linked in the Discord. Page 97, the build up. Yeah. So the build up to the fortissimo on page 97. This goes back into this thing of the entire page. While the rhythm here is actually goes. It had this. It wasn't. It kind of stayed. Not only tension-wise, but metrically and dynamically, it kind of stayed where it was at the beginning of page 97, going into the fortissimo on the climax, where it has the B minor chord in the second measure of the last system of that page, and it just felt like it needed. I don't want to repeat myself because I really hate doing that, but it's that tour de force of detail, that tension of the piece, that going from P, because I mean, if you follow page 97, it goes from P to marcato to MF to F, then back to P, and it's quiet again. And then you get back up to MF, and then you get back up to F, and then you hit the climax, and then we're off into the battle. So it's just the same thing, the same ideal of that. And one thing that was really good in some sections and then also really non-existent in other sections was this almost melodic, was the melodic intervoice. These drone notes you had, these bagpipe like, this weirdly enough, this reminded me of Irish music so much. This has, whether it's intentional or not, this objectively has so much Irish influence. You have these constant drones and at these certain intervals that they have on bagpipes. And you have inside of those these triplet, which Irish music has a lot in jigs. Ireland has tons of jigs. It's bum bum bum. You have one at the bottom, one on the top. You have the interior voices. It's great. And so the sections that are dance-like could be more dance-like, and they could be more fantastical. They could be more fun, and you can do this by a variety of tone colors. You could do, well, first of all, the dynamics and the accents and keeping the tempo relationships there would help, because the tempo doesn't actually change until it goes down to 132, I believe it is, in the section coming up. The poetry section is what I labeled it. So keeping that same tempo, but within that tempo, being able to change all this stuff and having certain dance sections, the conflict, these chords, these rigid da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, all these different things are all part of this big conflict, and it's not going to be a conflict if you don't make the sections conflict each other. And so they need difference, and they need a good bit of it, and that would really solidify this section as a whole. And so one thing that was really missing in a lot of sections was the melodic interior voice. Let's go back up in the score. I have it marked. Where it comes in on page 94 of the score, in the third system, in the second measure, where that B comes in the left hand, you have the C sharp. That thing. This is more now getting into the Bachian writing. We're having the counter melody in the left hand entirely syncopated with some of the previous rhythms, as well as this interior. It reminds me of something Bach would have done with maybe an aria or a movement of a giant work like a mass or something, that he takes this melody, and so does Lipanov throughout this piece, and he puts it on top and he puts it on the bottom, just like I was talking about in this Phalanx piece before this. He's moving around this melody, and this idea has a musical representation behind it, whatever you want that to be, whatever the story on this piece is for you. And that is one of the little tour guides. That's one of the little miniature ferry boats that takes us on this ride. And it's like a good cameraman, in a sense that he doesn't leave out important scenes of a movie. He's not going to have a movie without the main theme of the movie, the main character of the movie. And this is over and over and over, this main theme. It's what the entire piece is based off of. I mean, if you look at the triplets too, compositionally, this melody in page 94 in second system is actually forming the motivic. It's coming from the triplets, or vice versa, however he composed it, whatever he composed first. But it's the same intervallic material as the triplets, because you have these certain intervals of major and minor seconds followed by thirds, major and minor thirds. And the same construction block is what he's actually using to build the beginning of the piece, with this downhill thirds that I was talking about, like in this Phalanx. And so being able to have that main structure, that main anchor point, that main ferry boat to carry us through the piece is absolutely crucial. So bringing that melody out in the left hand, actually, and this is where Ravel and Debussy and technical training on that end of things comes really into play. Being able to have a weight retention to where you actually shift the weight of your arm into your left thumb and your second finger, so that while fingers 3, 4, and 5 are doing all the fancy work on top, you have the actual arm weight, so that you really don't have to actually press down the keys too much harder. You're just allowing the arm weight to naturally transfer to those keys to give you that bigger, broader sound. And if your arm weight is naturally tilted a little bit, if your wrist is conveying more accurately put your arm weight into your first and second fingers, then fingers 3, 4, and 5 are naturally going to play lighter without you having to do too much extra stuff to them on a technical level. So having that technical sense there, making that musical melodic idea present, is of the utmost importance. And then my next so my next note, so that was all of the consensus of the first section of the piece, essentially, was those fundamental ideas. And my next section, my next big comment was at the Poco Menomoso, going into page 99, from 98 to 99, when it goes into D flat major. So he says that the measure marking is a dotted eighth note equals 132. And and I have my handy dandy metronome here, and when I heard that for the first time, I kind of turned my head to the side and said, well, wait a minute, that's not 132. And so I tapped it on my phone, and the tempo that you were taking it at actually was dotted quarter note equals 80. And it stayed 80 plus or minus. It stayed around 80 until, let me think. It stayed around 80 until you pushed up to the climax on page 101, which I was going to talk about in just a second. But this is one of those moments where you're having the same melodic idea, actually. This is the same melodic idea, and just like I said in this link, in reverse. This is the inverted melodic idea from earlier. And now in D flat major, this is the poetry section. And one thing that I really loved, that I literally smiled the first time I heard this, and Josh was actually with me, but I'm not sure if he noticed this. I was in the voice chat and playing it on my own. Was that you brought out the counterpoint on this going in between the first and second measures of page 99, that that 4-3-2-3. That was I smiled and said because the inner Baroque music lover in me just smiled and was like, oh, that was sumptuous. I love that amount of attention to how do I say this? The amount of detail, the amount of attention to detail that you put into those two measures, bringing out all, because that was the whole two measures right there. The counterpoint, the articulations of the different counterpoints were absolutely immaculate. And if you had that attention to detail, but in the entirety of the piece, it's just a big dessert festival. It's like eating a giant chocolate cake that's just it's just delicious the entire time, and and you need that attention of detail, that level, that meticulous level that you put in those two measures and the entirety of the piece. And this is a very personal thing. This part isn't a personal thing. I don't think 80 equals 132. And I'm not saying that you should do 132, but 80 is certainly not in the ballpark of 132. So I would say bump that up a little bit. And I was actually playing through this earlier, and 132 seemed, depending on how you came into it, seemed a bit quicker. 120, 125 seemed a bit more reasonable. But the thing is that Lipanov is a very meticulous composer. He's like Durufle. He's like the person that we found at the Academy after. And that he didn't miss an ounce of detail in composing this. And something that's really interesting is that he didn't write a ritardando. And so I was like, well, wait a minute. He didn't write a ritardando. I'm a composer. Let me think about this as a composer would, and not like a pianist. And that's the key thing, is that in playing this piece, especially this piece, you have to think like a composer, not a pianist. Because I looked at this piece and I said, okay, why is there no retard here? Well, one, I see he's got a decrescendo. So I'm like, okay, well, where is he leading that decrescendo? He elongates the first note of the new section. That is ritardando. And I'm not saying that it should be absolutely solid going into 132, 125, whatever tempo that you decided to do it at, but it should be one continuous flow through. That he didn't want a ritardando because it makes it sound like if you do a run there, that it's almost the end of the piece, at least in the way that you did it. And so there's many different ways that you could approach this interpretationally. And I would absolutely be thrilled if you would record this and submit it again for a later masterclass, maybe in 2 weeks when he's actually in the masterclass now. One professor, Carlisle, teaches it. I would love to hear what you say about it, or he says about it. But I would love to hear for you to take this and polish it and see what you do, especially with the poetry section, especially with how you come into it. Because I was playing around with it, and I did it at least 1,000 ways that didn't sound good, and 14 or 15 ways that sounded actually pretty good. And I was like, well, wow, I kind of like all 14 or 15 ways of doing this. So I don't really know. I guess I'll just give free reign or whatever. But it's so many ways you could come into that. But a ritardando, a big ritardando, that is, maybe even 3/4 of ritardando is not actually good there. And compositionally, he doesn't actually write in a ritardando. Not even talking about the words, the word like ritardando. He doesn't write it in the notes, because with really great composers like Lipanov, you can see the ritardando in the notes. You don't have to know that there's a word there. It's like César Franck. It's like Bach. Bach didn't write ritardando ever in any of his ever. He didn't write ritardando in these big preludes and fugues, but we know when to because he wrote it into the notes, and that's a sign of a great composer. And here, the fact that he just stops right in the middle of this new section, right in the beginning of it, sorry, and not only does he stop, he actually has a pickup. So he's allowing you to adjust the tempo ever so slightly while having it not be a giant ritardando, because he gives you this breath to breathe, and then you pick up. And the main switch of the tempo happens between the D flat major chord and the pickup note, which is the A flat in the left hand by itself. That's where you, in between that and how you started, of course, and really the first measure actually, how you start that D flat and also, my next comment going out of that topic into this, which just flows from one to the next, is that within this poetry section, and this is my immense amounts of Andras Schiff influence talking, but it's that less is more. And I know Ian Oye loves to say this in terms of like law firm stuff, that less is more, and he's not wrong. And that it sounded like you really, really, really love this section. It's like really, really loving a girl, except that, you know, you might have loved that girl a little bit too much, and she's going to break your heart down the road, and you don't want that. So as a result, this had quite a bit too much ritardando and rubato and push and pull, because, and I know it's Russian, and I know it's a poetry section, but what is the best way to articulate this? It's that the music, and especially with this composer, the music is written in itself, that there's not too much that you need to do to it. And it goes back to the idea of the first page, that it's more or less just doing what's on the page. And that does not mean just play the notes. It does not mean it. And I've said this so many times, and people have come back to me, students have come back to me, and they've played it more metronomically than they ever have in their life. And I'm like, absolutely not. The music is contained on the page within the notes. And he tells you so much detail. I mean, he puts accents on every note that he wants. He puts pedal markings in. I mean, there was like, he puts everything in here, but he draws in phrases for you. He wants you to know where each phrase goes. I mean, he tells you, it's like giving you the cheat sheet to the music that like Bach and Sweelinck didn't give you. And so adding so much stuff to that he didn't add in there, it becomes a matter of, do you want youth to shine through the piece? Do you want to be the centerpiece of the piece? Or do you want the music and what the composer wrote to be the centerpiece of the piece? And whether we're talking about Cameron Carpenter versus, you know, name any other like opposite end organist, or whether we're talking about like Andras Schiff versus the very, very early Long, you know, the Showman Long, the early one, it's a matter of what your priorities are in the piece. And I can only speak from a very personal perspective in this, and that my priorities with music are letting the music come through and not me. Depending on the piece, there are exceptions, obviously, especially within Brahms, because Brahms is a personal composer, but this is not so personal. This is a story. This is like a great poet of the Middle Ages telling this big story. And he's like, and the opening is like he's announcing this great epic poem that's about to come, and then this section is the epic poem, you know. And so having that, allowing the music just to speak without forcing so much stuff on it would benefit it immensely. And so as a result of that, I think, and there's so much. I have like 3 pages of notes on this on the slow section. Like I have so much to say about it, but I can condense that into one thing, and that is, let it sing. Let the music and the notes that are on the page sing, because if you do that, I can almost guarantee you 99% that you'll find it flows not only much more naturally, but much more efficiently, much more effectively, and technically it actually won't require as much of you, because it won't require this intricate balancing game of tempo to tempo, phrase to phrase. Rather, if you just let it sing and flow along naturally like a brook, you know, it'll flow along naturally. And this section is actually believe it or not, this section is quite relatable to Schubert's Impromptu, number 3, Opus 90, the G flat major one, because it's like you don't just a brook. If you imagine a river going downhill, the river just doesn't stop. It doesn't just speed up. It doesn't just slow down. You have twists and turns, and everything that the water does is natural. Everything that there's pebbles in there, the water moves. Interesting things happen, but the water nonetheless is flowing. And the water, it's actually interesting as a symbolic thing. The water is on top of the pebbles. The water flows regardless of where the pebbles are. So as long as the pebbles are like your personal inputs into the piece. So no matter what you put into the piece, the water should be on top and the water should be flowing regardless. And when you got to this section, it was like the water stopped and then it started and then it stopped and then it started and then it stopped and then it started, and it was just like stop, start. It was like red light, green light, red light, green light, red light, green light, over and over and over and over and over. And so these beautiful phrases that he literally wrote on the page with phrase marks, and even the sub phrases like the D flat to the C to the D flat and going down to the G flat, that wasn't brought out as a result. And in the turn, we had a lot of like sub things that weren't actually that important being brought out, and it took away from the piece. And so having that sense of doing too much, it actually threw off the climax, because you kept around the ballpark of that 80 tempo until you got to only a few measures before the climax, and then it went from 80 to 121, like all of a sudden, and you climaxed at 121 beats per minute. And that climax was actually about where I would say that this section could have been started at. And the climax was really great. It was effective. Like after you got there and you were going on, the energy was great. And the way that you carried that down into the kind of chordal-esque like bouncing section that you get at the end of 103 going into 104, that was all great. 104, this section was great. Tempo fluctuated. It wasn't the rigidness that it needed, but it was still like the energy was there, and I would say metronome practice with that section. And then going into avoiding anything technical, going into it's just more dynamic stuff, more attention to detail, more accents. I'm just going down this and looking at my notes on the side. The other climax on page 105, the other fortissimo going into the choral section, same thing. That actually didn't build up. It started to get quieter and slower going into the chords on the third system of 105, and I wasn't sure why it got slower and quieter for part of that, but it should be doing the opposite, I think. And then
yeah, that part I still have technical issues with. So the slow and quiet was just because I'm like, I can't play this part.
Understood. And then going through that, the Pio Tranquillo and 106, the same comments as before. The inner melody in the left hand on the thumb this time really could have been brought out. And actually, what's so wonderful about this section is that, unlike the other section, a really warm tone color. This is where like the warmth comes through. We're approaching the end of this great poem, the epic poem, where this great musical journey that we've been on, we're approaching the end of it. And so now things are taking a turn for the better, and there's more major. There's compositionally, he's introducing the major side of the key a lot more. So there's a lot more sections in major now than there were in minor, because the ratio at the beginning of the piece is much heavier on the minor than it's the major. And as you go through the piece, what he's actually doing is he's transferring major to minor ratios. So now we have a lot more major ratios on this side of the piece. And so now it's in a tenor voice. So now it's, instead of being a woman's voice, it's a man's voice. And it's this deep warmth, like coming from the depths, and it's really gorgeous. And you can do a lot more with tone color, a lot more with having your thumb play these notes and sing a lot more, and some intricate pedal work in there could make it really stand out. And then my last comment was 107 into 108. Maybe it's a technical difficulty thing again. 107 into 108, the last system going into the chords, the Piomoso. It just slowed down a lot again. Like it got really, really slow. Going up the da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, and then the chords. It got pretty slow going into the chords. And I would say actually the tension of the tempo retention, the idea of building the tension through that just absolute metric control of the pulse, because if you keep a rigid tight control in that pulse, and you push it ever so slightly without rushing, along with observing the dynamics and the accents, when you get to those chords, it's just going to be like, Elijah off in the chariot to God. It's going to be like you've just broken free and you're gone. And that's that whole idea, back to the first thing I said, of the contrast between poetry and conflict, these sections and how they play into each other. Because he's such a brilliant composer. He's one of the greats, and he's so underappreciated and recognized. And I thought the end of the piece was great and exciting. And you did it. You did the triple fortissimo rapido very well, and it was very exciting and very articulated and very loud. And it reminded me of the towards the end of the section of the Scarbo and Gaspard de la Nuit de Ravel, it was kind of like you played that kind of like Ravel. You just went bum, boom, and it was great. So the ending was exciting, and that's what I had to say about that. But it's at a really high level, and it's just, I think, the finessing of the musical ideas and attention to detail that would, and if you did that, it would absolutely be a winning performance for any competition that you entered, 100%. So that's my thoughts on it.
Thanks so much. That was really helpful.
Well, thank you for submitting it, and you're a wonderful musician. And notice I say not pianist, but musician. So you're a wonderful musician, and I look forward to hearing it again sometime.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, thank you.
And I'll open the floor up to any comments on that before we move on. Josh, nothing.
I could. Well, okay. There's not much to say. You covered a lot, and I have not played this piece. Certainly, in terms of harmonic structure, it reminds me a lot of the Balakir of Islamé.
Yeah.
Of course, a contemporary composer, and covering many of the same ideas compositionally. And I was struck by the fact that it has many of the same challenges in playing it effectively, in that a lot of the great performances of the Islamé, Boris Berezovsky comes to mind. It's a wonderful performance, but my criticism about that performance is that the lyrical section in the middle is just lacking contrast from the bombastic and relentless opening and ending sections. And I think that is just a challenge that is inherent to pieces that are structured and composed like this. I think that in this case, when Matt was talking about all of these different contrasts and stuff like that, I think the things that you will end up finding need the most change are the quiet sections and not the loud sections. It's very easy to play chords loudly and quickly on a piano, once you understand how to do it, of course. I mean, sure, there's a technical challenge between, hitting all the right notes, but from a musical perspective, loud, fast chords is about as basic as it gets musically. The lyrical sections are that's killer. Just reading through the score, I certainly don't have the facility to play that in a convincing way. And, maybe I should, but I don't. I think that one thing I was noticing is all of these decrescendos marked into the score, and they're very strategically placed. So, for instance, where'd it go? The score is impossible to find anything in.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Where was it? Forgive me, I know what it looks like, I just can't find it.
And by.
Yeah, I know. Well, anyway, it's basically that it's in the more lyrical sections where you have these kind of passages floating up in the right hand and down in the left hand to a chord, and on each of those it decrescendos down to a pianissimo, and that's a really interesting thing to do, because normally when you have stuff moving outward towards a chord, normally if it's Liszt, for instance, you're crescendoing into that, And here it's, a diminuendo, it's fading away into the chord. I think bringing that out a bit more would be really interesting. And part of it, it's very interesting that Matt mentioned the Gaspard, because I was going to mention that as well, but in a completely different way. And that's that those quiet lyrical sections, yes, okay, it's Russian and it's romantic and all that, but the sort of kind of floating quality to it, the ethereal floating quality, is something that you could at least play with in a lot of the more lyrical sections, where I guess really my main criticism of the lyrical section in this is that it sounded a little too notey. Like you were still playing all those notes, and you hadn't quite gotten that relentless atmosphere out of your head yet from the beginning, and just letting it sort of exist without doing too much to it, and letting it float along. So that's a lighter and a more ethereal color that maybe you could go for. But other than that, there's nothing really I have to say. It's a very impressive performance, and I really look forward to hearing this when you have it all polished up and you're playing it in Carnegie Hall and all that.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you, Josh. Anyone else? Ian, can you help anyone else here? Nope? No? Okay. All right, let's hear some Durufle. Okay, question. I'll let you guys decide because I'm impartial. Should we hear, because they're both short pieces, should we hear Opus 13 and 12 back to back, and then we talk about both of them? Because it's not a lot of memory retention. Or should we hear them, like 13 talk about it and 12 talk about it? What do you guys think? I'm
I'd
referring.
probably go with both if they're shortish.
What?
I'd probably go with listening to both if they're shortish, but
Yeah.
it's just my take. Yeah.
Well, they're quite short. Yeah, the first one's like 2 minutes, and the second one's like 4.5 minutes. So yeah, they're quite short. Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and hear both of them, and then we'll come back in a second. out of 11. Josh, do you want to give it a second then? I think we can go ahead personally. Ian Durufle. So talk to me. I'm
Yes.
I'm getting my thoughts together. And I'm pulling back up the other recording because I had it. I want to look at the scores. I'm talking to you about it, and I had the score up for the fugue instead of the first one.
Yep.
Let me get the score back up. Okay, I'm gonna pause it so I can skip around the score. Oh, it's just one piece, white paper, right? Right. Okay, on one screen. So how open was your swell box in this? Because the mixtures were way too loud.
It was fully open.
Yeah, no. So in French writing in general, fully open is fortissimo with 2 Fs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was definitely way too loud. Which rendered the chant, the Epiphany chant under it, not as audible. In terms of a general thing for this piece, I wouldn't encourage doing agogic accents in Durufle. There were quite a few Baroque articulations in this piece that I would not recommend. Especially the last note. It sounded like you hopped 2 to 2 or thumb to thumb, something there. It was yeah. And then phrasing wise, that it's important to remember that this is still a prelude on a chant, and that it's a chant is sung. And so contrary to Frederick Blanc's very impaired recording of this on YouTube, that this actually is a sung piece, quote unquote, so that it's to be sung. And so like a sung piece, a sung lyrical piece, that is, the singer would not, the soloist, the big soloist, would not come in without knowing they're not going to come in. And what I mean by that is there was no indication that the chant coming in on the positive was actually, like, there was no indication that was coming up. So a sectional transfer from that to the next section, like letting people know, like taking a small bit of time there and allowing that to flow. Also, don't tell me that was me, but why is there a breath marking drawn in there?
That's me.
Nah, no. There definitely shouldn't be a breath marking in there. I mean, if you're staying true to Durufle, that is, but that's just one continuous line. And also, again, the idea of phrasing this piece, that I would actually, it seemed like you were going for more Frederick Blanc's vibe of the piece, but then again, he's even like laughed to me about how impaired he was when he made that video. He was like, I think it was 5.5 or 6 classes a line down. The dude's not okay. Anyways, yeah, he's not okay in that recording. But even worse was his live recital, which was actually hilarious to watch because he was like really not okay then. It was like more like 7 or 8 classes a line. But regardless of that, like the dude's not okay. But I love him. He's like my best friend. But I don't know how to. I play this piece like you're singing it. Like it didn't sound like it was being sung, and it didn't sound like it had anything to do with the chant. And so remember that the foundational basis of this piece is a chant, and a chant is sung. So in order to play this piece, you have to sing it. So sing the tenor line, sing the left-hand line over and over, and you should be able to sing this. And of course, take breaths where you need to, but sing this and be able to make it through the entirety of the phrase and then breathe. And when you do that, you'll notice that your playing of it will get better. And I know this is all repeat information for you, but like it's still a core principle that needs to be executed in the playing of this piece, as well as special moments like meter changes, because chant wasn't written in meter. So for those of you who don't know what Gregorian chant is, Gregorian chant was sung in the church before hymns and the stuff that we know now was, and it was sung majoritively in the most primitive stages in unison or with a drone at the fifth or tonic, or essentially those two notes. And it was sung without meter. There was no 4/4, 3/4, 2/4. It was either an alternatum with an organ, or it was just sung, and there was no meter to it. It was just these long phrases. And so in modern music, we have these metric systems that we put in place. And so we had the idea: how do we bring this ancient art, this ancient music, into modern composition? Excuse me. And so these metric markings that Durufle puts in here: 5/8, 6/8, 8/8, 5/8, 6/8. It's just one after another, relentless 7/8, 5/8, 6/8, just back to back to back to back to back. And when that happened, you were emphasizing the change in meter. Like you were emphasizing not the phrase, but the change in meter, and it's a very crucial difference. And emphasizing the change in meter in this actually isn't something that would be in correlation with the fundamental base of the piece, which is chant. Rather than that, the chant should just sing through. Because if you're trying to accent meter in this piece, good luck. You won't catch me doing it, because I'll get a headache after the first page. But because it's just every other measure changing constantly, and that is a clear indication, compositionally speaking, in terms of that you're not supposed to. And another compositional indication of that is that it's literally based off of a chant, and chants don't have meter. And this is the chant, and this is a relatively free prelude. There are many instances in which you can take time. Now, don't listen to my recording of this on SoundCloud unless you want to. If you want to listen to it and laugh, I encourage that, but I don't encourage a serious listening of it, because that was me after like practicing it for a total of 30 minutes and then performing it live in recital. So that had too much rubato in it, because I forgot in my Complete Works of Durufle concert that one was recorded in. I had forgotten to learn the Swazon Fugue and the Prelude to Opus 13. So I just learned those like in the days prior to the concert and then performed them. So don't make that your base recording, please. I tell everyone that. But in the same sense, that this should have a lot of liberty, not like David Durkop liberty, you know what I'm saying, but like liberty in the piece, to where it sings, and it sings naturally. The key is natural. Like I was telling him in the live Panave tube, that it shouldn't be forced. It should be natural. Other than that, I mean, it's the same thing. It's a short piece with a miniature. That's really, it's not much to cover in this piece. It's just let it sing like a chant, and don't put broke articulation in it. Yeah. And then for the fugue, so I have more questions about this, because I've never heard anyone play it this way, and so I have a lot of questions. So the first is, what makes you choose to play the beginning like you do? It's a very open question, but I want an open answer, so it fits the answer that I want. And let me flip back to the video. There's your face. Hello again. So what makes you play the beginning like you do?
I guess the starting point is what I'm fighting against, which is my instincts from. The starting point is, this is the first Durufle piece that I've ever played. And in general, I avoid playing music and organs of this, genre. But, I thought I'm going to give it a go. I need to stretch and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And my instinct is to stick with one familiar, Bach, Baroque, Buxtehude, and those things. So that is what I'm fighting against in the first place, my instinct of what I would do if I just saw this plan and I, was going for it. And so I'm perhaps I'm experimenting, but the first point for me is I've tried to do is just think about that that legato is the base for this playing and for the writing, and that legato is the norm, and everything else then works off that. But I'm working off, my a technique that comes from the other extreme. Everything's articulated to some extent,
Mm.
and at the same time, so I'm kind of trying to bring the two together to be able to articulate on the organ with a technique that I'm not generally, I haven't played for a very long time,
Mm.
and what I'm trying to get across is this sense of the flow, but at the same time, it's not just mush and it's not just, blah.
Mm.
But and so that's the starting point. The third is that it's compound time. It's that the sense that you have to have of,
Mhm.
2, 3, 2 and a beat, 3 and a beat, but with the triplets in there, and but it's trying to vary. I'm still trying to get it straight in my head, and that's why both Opus 12 and Opus 13 sound like a struggle. They are a struggle because when I'm not paying attention, my body wants to go baroque, and it's only when I listen back and I get the critiques from other people that then I kind of notice. Okay, I got to reimagine that. So this is the second time I played this for you, right? I mean, the first time I did it
I don't think the first
was ages.
was the first time that you did this actually in a masterclass. I don't think it was. If I
Yeah.
remember correctly.
Uh,
I thought
possibly.
I thought
You
you
go.
put it in the Durufle channel or something, and then you asked me about it.
Yeah, this is the second recording. This is the second recording I asked you in the Durufle channel. I did do this for a masterclass
Okay.
about maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks after I picked it up. So it'd be about March. And it was, so I tried to iterate on the feedback then. I don't think it's quite there yet, but certainly it's more technically secure, which kind of frees me up to then think a little bit more about what
Mm.
else what to tune, because technically it's more secure. But I take your point. Nobody else plays it like that, but I don't necessarily want to play like other people, as you know, right? I just want to play to be the
You
the
don't
best that I can be, and be true to myself, but
Mm.
informed.
So the first thing that I think comes to mind is that I would like to reemphasize à la française when playing this, and that is that it is wildly overthought. That this is a very, 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 very simple piece. In terms of technicality, in terms of rhythm, in terms of phrasing. Durufle gives you the phrasing. I mean, from the first scale that you have in the third measure of the piece, I'm looking at it now, the dee da da dee da da dum ba bum pa. That scale never ends. I'm dead serious when I say that scale never ends until the end of the piece. You have the da 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 dum, and then immediately the left hand dee da 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 dum, and then the right hand dee da 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 dum, and then the left hand dee da 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 dee da da dee da 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 dee da da dee da 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 da. It just goes on and on and on. I mean, it's like the analogy that I gave with the brook. That once you start playing it, the piece plays itself. I mean, it's like driving a car. I'm so serious. You crank the car, and all you have to do is just press the gas pedal after you get on the road. Like, once you get her started, and you just press the gas pedal, she runs beautifully. It's like a good old '64 Mustang. She runs beautifully. And so the same thing applies to this piece, and that is that it's being vastly overthought. There were lots of amounts of, and I'm so glad you played this next to the other pieces that we had, because everything that I talked about in Lipanoven and Svelink, I can just go copy and paste right into this, and that is that it's the same fundamental principles. and that the piece just needs to flow. You shouldn't do anything to it, and it shouldn't have these great big retardandos. I'll mention the end later, but at the end, yeah, I'll mention it later. But that happened at the end too. But this is a jig. This is a jig fugue, and not only is this like a jig fugue, this is bells. And he wrote this with the same compositional technique that he wrote at the end of the Prelude and Fugue on Land, Opus 7, which, for those of you who don't know, was a piece that he wrote for one of his friends who got shot in World War II. And that the whole idea that this piece is an ascension, this piece is really an ascension to heaven, is what it's about. It's the tool, the compositional tool to get you to heaven, what is the bells. And it's the same thing that he does in the fugue of Opus 7 that he's carrying into this to further play with the ideas. And that is that the idea in Opus 7 was that the fugue is a land going from from death to life again, his rebirth into Christ or heaven. And what transports him there is the ideas of bells. So the second fugue of the Opus 7, the fugue is, those are bells. There's like heaven's bells off in the distance, and they're and so the same thing is here. These are big bells. These aren't these little tiny bells that are growing and growing into huge bells like the end of the fugue. This is ta pum ba pim ba pim ba pum ba da 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 dum ba pum ba da da dum ba bum ba bim ba bum ba dim ba bum. It's you set that first piece, and what this may be a no-brainer thing to say, but people don't think of it, is a great thing to do before you play the first note is, in your head, play the first three measures. So you can go, and without the pickup, and then instead of playing like in your head an F on the end of that third measure, and so it just kind of carries you right into the piece. And that's what the piece is. I mean, he didn't. This is a no matter of fact, no bull crap. This is just, he puts you in the piece. It's a simple piece. It's a good piece. And while it's not literally about anyone dying and going to heaven, it has this massiveness and this musical sense of that he was really going for in this. And simplicity carries the way. I mean, even in a theological standpoint, when Christ says in the New Testament, I am the way and the truth and the life, and nobody comes to the Father except through me. Well, this is the through me. That's pretty simple, actually, in terms of theology. It's very, very simple that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and there's no other way. And this is the same thing, that Durufle doesn't give you any other pathway to take. He gives you one pathway, and not only does he literally give you one, not only does he metaphysically give you one pathway, he literally gives you one pathway by giving you one note to start the piece with. He's like, here's the path, and you're going to follow it down right into the scale run, and the scale run's going to carry you to the end of the piece. And that's all you do with it. There's nothing else to do with the piece. There's no great big rubatos or moments like that. It's just this one glorious river. But this is a different river. This river is widening. And as the piece goes on, it's widening, and it's getting more and more water, more volume, and it's huge crashing chords at the end. They're like the biggest bells you can imagine, just gloriously ringing left and right, swaying. And the physical sensation, going back to the laws of physics, the physical sensation of this bell should be felt as a physical sensation. And I've always told people, and especially my students, that music should be felt as a physical sensation. Not only should you play with the technicality of it, not only should you study it in your mind, academically and metaphysically and spiritually and however, all those different ways of studying music and processing music, it should be felt as a physical sensation just as much as having a big bass drum pound the beat in the room that you're in. That this music, no matter what it is, whether it's piano, harpsichord, organ, should be felt internally as a physical vibration. And that physical vibration should give you feedback on how you play it. And if you aren't feeling the weight of the water, the weight of the river, the weight of the bells tolling, the weight of the gravity when the bell goes up and it kind of stops, and it goes down and it tolls and it goes back up, these big side to side, all of these like metric, gravitational, physical, like in the sense of the science physical, these physical sensations should be felt, and they should be felt very, very, very deeply. And so that's the majority of what I'd say about the piece. I mean, that it was hugely overthought, and it slowed down in quite a few places that it shouldn't have slowed down, especially because he doesn't write ritordandos in here. Legato, again, a lot of places weren't legato. I assume maybe it's because you don't have giant hands, which I can understand that. And
I have very small hands.
well, I won't critique that because that's not something
Small,
that's
stubbly hands.
yeah. Sometimes you just gotta make a little jump in if you got small hands, but and that's all right. But the build up, the pulse should be felt heavier and heavier as the piece goes. The emphasis on the first beat. Da 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 dee da da dee da da tum pum 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 pum, and then going into the ending is these big chords, pum 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 pum, which ironically, instead of allowing this giant river to just flow and have this beautiful, massive weight and quality to it, you kind of stopped there. And I'm not sure why you stopped, but you stopped. And I wouldn't stop, because it takes away the whole purpose of the piece behind it, which is to get you to this moment in the climax when you have the great reeds and the cornet come on. And well, not only did you stop, you actually the pom pom, you cut that chord. I believe it was either short or too long. I can't remember at this point because it was both pieces together. But you cut it one way or another. Then you picked it up entirely while keeping your left hand playing, allowed your left hand to play for a while, and then the right hand chord came in after the acoustic was partially gone out of the room and the left hand was playing steadily. So the right hand chord of that first measure of the climax was entirely offset, and it was a big delay in the
Yeah,
note.
there's a technical.
What?
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Those are technical points. It is because
Pom.
that's a point where I'm trying to do a registration change, and I'm trying to punch the sequencer with one foot, while I think I do a wild reach with my left foot or right foot, and I'm off balance. That's a technical point. I actually have to work out. Those points where it slows down in the middle are not deliberate. They are technical points where I'm off balance. I was trying to do every single registration change as written on the score,
Yeah, which is doable.
and just thinking that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah, that's just technical.
well, the stop,
Thanks.
good. The stop sounded good, and then another thing is that wasn't technical. That I know wasn't technical. Was, and I've never heard a single person do this other than Frederick Blanc, so it does not surprise me in the slightest. The syncopations in the climax, bum bum beam pum pum, and I know it's a syncopation because of the left hand. It's a ba bum ba bum ba bum. It has this offbeat, this ba bum, and then it's tied. And so this goes from it's a classic Durufle. He's doing hemiola here in a 6/8 meter, or 9/8 meter, and so bring out the hemiola. It shouldn't sound like 1 2 3 1. It's 1 2 1 2 bum 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 bum. It's just again, it's just the river building climax of the last chord, and then on the note of the syncopation, you carry that to the octaves leading to the big 3 chords that lead into the climax. 2 comments. You had 2 measures of an octave held that were held for about a total of 6/8 notes. So those actually do need to be counted out. Yeah, so definitely give those for full value. Your tenuto marking, or maybe it was my tenuto marking from the scan over the A, whether it's mine or not, that tenuto marking on the last system of the piece, ba-bum, the pedal should be just strong, and it should be huge, just ba-bum, beep-bum. Again, count in between the big chords, count out the tie. And then when you get to the last chord, you played the last chord like a quarter note. And it's a dotted half note with a double fermata that says long over it. So
yeah, I know. I was totally freaked out by that stage.
yeah,
I was actually. This was my. I don't know. 16 takes in a row of this. This was the last take, and I was giving up from the night. It was 3 a.m. So I don't usually do that at the end, I know, but
Right.
this was obviously it was like I give up.
Got you.
I think you probably feel that by the end.
Well,
I actually just gave up.
when you missed notes on both of those two chords that are just A minor chords, I was like, yeah, he's pretty tired. It wasn't even judgment. I was like, yeah, this dude's like, he's recording this at like 4 a.m. or something. So that makes sense. I do that stuff on
But
the
no, I know. I
yeah,
mean, I'm going to do a better one, but this
gotcha.
is for masterclass. I'm going to work a
Yeah,
bit
for
of it.
sure. And it's really nothing huge. Just don't overthink it and play it, and then let it drive itself to the end, and then just do what's written. I mean, Durufle writes in the hemiolas, he writes in the phrases. Just as long as you do what's written with Durufle, you'll just flow right to the last note, and it'll be the best performance ever. And I'm not actually over exaggerating. If you do exactly what's written, it's the best performance ever. So
Yeah,
yeah,
one thing that does freak me about Durufle, and it's not just this one, but other Durufle works, is because there's so many different editions of this, like those crashing chords and they are completely different the way it's written, right? In different editions.
what do you mean? Oh yeah, well,
So,
this is the original. Yeah.
yeah, and I came back to my conclusion was, all right, I'll stick with this original. But the one that everybody else plays from, and all the recordings that are have those crashing chords as held the full they are written differently, and so the hemiola doesn't necessarily I mean, thank you for clarifying on the hemiola, because I wasn't sure whether to try and effectively smooth over the hemiola or
Yeah.
actually just do it, because
Yeah.
on the right hand the chords are actually written differently in
Yeah.
terms of the time values and the breaks in different editions,
Well,
which is confusing.
well, I recall covering this now in last masterclass about when you did this several months ago. Those chords were an editor's editing of them um, because the editor, not knowing what he was doing, as most editors don't, that he didn't realize that those would have been full written out chords had it not been for the very large acoustic in French churches. So the rest are for the acoustic. And so, and even if you are in a small town Baptist church with a floor full of carpet and negative 4-second acoustic where it just literally sucks the vacuum of sound into the carpet, that even if you are there, you still wouldn't tie those. Because, I mean, first of all, there's no technical way you can tie those. And secondly, on top of that, it would sound ridiculous. Like, it would go, I would bury my head in my arms and cry. So it just wouldn't make sense. So, yeah, that's just an editor's lack of understanding about the piece. And that's the original edition, and that's why it's so important that, and for those of you who don't know Durufle, these are Durufle's smallest organ works. These are his most, they're not insignificant, but these are his most insignificant. And so having an understanding that this is Durufle's worst output, literally, this is his absolute worst output. Like, compared to the Bene Creator and the Suite and the Requiem, this is completely meaningless. So, for those of you who haven't heard Durufle, go to the Maurice Durufle channel. I have it in the server for a reason. Go to the Why Maurice Durufle page on our website, read about him, listen to his Requiem recording with the orchestra, listen to the Bene Creator, the Opus 4, listen to his toccata from the Suite, like, hear what he actually sounds like in his true larger form. But yeah, that's why it's so important that we preserve his legacy, because the new editions, I hate this edition, is the most cringe. There's a new $22 edition of Durufle by, I don't know who it's by. It's some reprint of Duran that someone like wrote over, and it's in this thick book. And Bruce, who's a student at School of the Arts, bought it. And I when he brought it and I read it, I literally took the book. I remember ripping the book, and then I bought him new scores that were originals. Like, I got so angry at the changes in the score, because it was ridiculous. Like, there's just new, and this it's a compiled volume of the Durufle edition of pieces, and it's just horrendous. It's got so much, like, it's got fingerings in it, and it's got like all these phrase markings and dynamics and registration suggestions. And I'm like, dude, get this out of here. And when Frederick Blanc saw that, he had a catastrophe and like ended up suing them, and they pulled it out of print. he had a stroke. And I was in France when they published it. He found out, and I remember he called me and he wanted to go to the bar, and so I met him. He never wants to go to the bar in the middle of the day. He's always gay clubs in. So I went to the bar with him in the middle of the day. He left the gay club, and I was like, I know something's wrong. And so I met him there, and he was just like raging. He was like having a fit. He just like didn't go to mass that day either. I don't know who played the mass, but he just skipped mass. He didn't even go. So the dude was raging, and I didn't blame him. And then when I got back to America and saw that Bruce had bought that edition, I was like, absolutely not. So yeah, that's why it's so important that we preserve Durufle's legacy and the original intent, and that's why I preserve all the original scores that I have to try to give them to other people. So yeah. So that's that. Josh, you want to close this out, I guess? My throat hurts to talk.
I'm certainly not the authority on Durufle that Matt is, but so I'm not going to say anything about Durufle specifically, but I do know you as a person, Ian, and you're a lawyer, which means you are very, very, very good at thinking about things, which, we all appreciate that. But you said, when talking about the fugue, I wrote it down, you said that as you made progress with the technical side of things, that it freed you up to think more. Now, let's think about that. You said that the better technique freed you up to think more. For me, it's always better technique frees me up to think less. I don't have to think so hard about what I'm doing. I can just play and not have to worry about it. So I think that, it's just amusing that kind of your tendency and my tendency are complete opposites, because you're such a hard worker and I'm the laziest person on earth. If I can get away with not thinking, I don't think. And so, but when it comes to French music, and especially French music, which is so well defined like this, I really don't think you have to think so hard, because as Matt said, it is all there. Everything that you need to do is on the score. And if you're worried about it sounding different from everyone else because you don't want to be just yet another piece of the puzzle, you want yours to be different, it will be different just by nature of you being the one playing it. If I'm going to say a sentence, and then you're going to say a sentence, when I say it, it's going to sound like I have a North Carolina accent, and when you say it, it's going to sound like you live in Australia. And it's not that we're thinking hard about that being the way it's going to happen, it's that we're two different people and fundamentally we're going to sound different, whether or not we're talking or whether we're playing. We don't have to think about it. So I think as much as you can, try not to overthink everything. Try not to think about all these phrases. Try not to just listen and play and sit in the sound and just play. And don't worry about it sounding different, because it will sound different, because you are you and I'm me and Matt is Matt. It just will. You don't have to think about it. But that means that it frees you up not to have to think so hard, which makes the technical side of things easier. It makes following the score easier, and you don't have to think so hard about it sounding different, and it will happen anyway and sound much more natural in the process. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah. Well, if no one, does anyone else have comments? Because if not, we're good. Yeah, we're good. Well, thank you all for coming. It was a wonderful privilege and honor to be able to sit here and discuss music at this finite level with you all. And I will look forward to seeing you again soon. And next weekend, next weekend, I'm hosting a masterclass in a server with 4,000 people in it plus. I'll post more about that later this week, but that's going to be a server partnership, so we should be able to draw in a bunch of people from that. It's going to be a big recruiting tool. So I'll be teaching over on that server. If you want to come by and watch it, I would encourage if you want to. And I'll be teaching their participants. Having said that,
Which server is it?
Let me scroll and look. I have it in one of the admin chats. Yes, Box Street. So it has
I'm not even on that server. I'm going to join it.
It has 4,400 people roughly in it. So yeah, that'll be a good fun masterclass. But yeah, thank you all for coming. It was a privilege and a pleasure to see you and talk to you.